Welcome to the PSID 2021 interviewer training video on occupation and industry probing. To get started, let's remind ourselves why occupation and industry probing is so important. There are literally thousands of occupations and industries in the code books provided by the US Census Bureau, which are updated every 10 years. We have a team of coders at SRO who take the information you enter in each interview and review it carefully to find the code that best fits the job described. If the data you provide are not complete, the code they're able to assign might not be accurate. Analysts using the PSID data don't have the opportunity to hear the way the respondent describes his or her job. Instead, they rely on the occupation and industry codes assigned to each job. So the codes are only as good as the data the interviewer provides. Occupation and industry probing is not difficult, but it might seem that way at first because it's quite different from other types of probing you're trained to do. It's more conversational. However, the biggest skill that it requires is really good listening. We ask occupation and industry questions about jobs held by the reference person and spouse partner. For each job, our occupation and industry information is collected across 3 separate Blaze screens. The questions we asked are used across many studies and by many survey organizations, not only on the PSID. First, we have a screen with 3 questions. We ask the respondent to tell us in detail about the job in question. What is the occupation? What work does the reference person or spouse partner do? What are the most important activities or duties? You will read all 3 of these questions together at one time. You can also use them as probes if you need to. If the reference person is a factory worker, for example, what does she do at the factory? Work on an assembly line? Work as a press operator? A custodian? Maybe a foreman? We want the best description you can get of her job tasks. After you have finished entering the open ends for occupation, the next question we will ask is what industry the job is in. This may seem easy, but it can be tricky because what we really want to know is the industry of the company they work for. So if a person is a janitor in a travel agency, the industry is related to the travel agency. Unless they are a contractor for a maintenance company and they are contracted to work at the travel agency, in that case, we would want to know about the maintenance company. This is where your active listening and probing skills are particularly helpful. Finally, we also separately ask for the official job title. This information can help the coders assign the census code. Let's go through some examples together and think about why probing may be important. Focusing on occupation. What if the respondent tells you his occupation is engineer? Without good probing, this could mean many things. Does he drive a train? Is she an electrical engineer, a nuclear engineer, a chemical engineer? Maybe he is an automotive engineer at Ford or GM. But then what? Does he specialize in body design, parts design, engine design? Let's use another common example. The respondent tells us she's a nurse. Is she an RN, an LPN, or a nurse practitioner? Does she do patient care, hospice care, or does she draw blood at the Red Cross? Does she specialize in working with children or in the ER? What about an interviewer? Does the interviewer interview people on the TV? Does he screen candidates for jobs? Does she work for a market research company or do polls for Gallup or work on academic social research studies at the University of Michigan? In that case, does she work only on telephone studies or does she go in person? Does she use a laptop? You can see there are many details that we would like to know in order to code the occupation properly. Now let's look at the specific PSID probing rules. PSID probing guidelines may differ from those you've learned on other studies. On some screens, you will be prompted either not to probe or to limit your probing to up to 3 probes. Reference person, spouse partner, current main job, or recent main job are the most important jobs we ask about in the interview. On these screens, on the occupation question, you will be asked to probe up to 3 times. On industry, you will probe as usual. On all other types of jobs, you will see the on-screen instruction not to probe either occupation or industry. Let's talk about why we have this 3-probe limit on the occupation probing. This limit was imposed on PSID 2 waves ago. It was based on methodological findings from a study that indicated that requesting more detail on occupation was adding burden to both respondents and interviewers without adding value for coders. On PSID, the most you will ever probe occupation is up to 3 times. It's also fine to probe fewer than 3 times if you have collected sufficient information with fewer probes. We'll give more examples of just enough probing later in this presentation and when we meet live together. What occupation probes to use? Well, you can look at your reference card. There's an occupation industry tab and a yellow card that provides instruction about occupation probes and industry probes. There are a lot of good guidelines also in the question by question objective for question BC 20, and we'll review that together when we meet. However, if nothing else, please be sure to probe, do you supervise anyone else? This is one of the key questions that's used to code appropriately based on the census code. And it's important that you ask this every time. To round out your probing on occupation, you'll always ask, is there anything else you can tell me about your occupation? Please try to always end your probing with an anything else probe. Other occupation questions. We've already talked about the occupation and industry questions in section BC. These are the key occupation and industry questions in the questionnaire. However, there are some other locations where occupation and industry questions can pop up. For example, in section G, if the respondent mentions other jobs that are not accounted for in section BC. Also, occupation questions for jobs that are OFMs age 16 and up may be asked. Section KL includes occupation industry questions about new reference person or spouse partner's first full-time job. Also, occupation questions are asked about the mother and the father of reference persons and spouse partners and what job they did when they were growing up. In some cases, the respondent might not know the details about these occupations. This is especially true with the father and mother questions. Do your best to gather the information they can provide, but don't probe too far into this section when the respondent indicates that he or she just doesn't have the information you're requesting. Common industry probes. The principles of industry probing are the same. Here are some examples of industry probes. Industry questions will either be labeled with an instruction not to probe, or no guidance will be provided, and then you'll probe just as you usually would. There's no PSID limit on the number of times you may probe industry, but generally it doesn't really require all that much probing compared to occupation. Note, you shouldn't simply read through the list of probes on your card when you're talking to the respondent. Be sure you're actively listening and responding to what you hear. For example, don't ask what they make something out of if it's clear that they don't make anything. We'll review common industry probes when we meet together live. Let's look at a few examples. What kind of probes would you use to get good industry data for these categories? Let's start with the first one, food. If the respondent tells you that she works in the food industry, we want to know more about the place she works. So for example, we might say, tell me about the place you work. How large is the place you work? Is it publicly or privately owned? Is it a manufacturing or sales or a service enterprise? If it's sales, are products sold wholesale or retail? If the respondent works in the hospitality industry, you might also say, tell me more about the place you work. Is it a manufacturing or sales or a service enterprise? If it's service, what is provided to the customer? How large is the place you work? Is it a chain or a single location? Is it publicly or privately owned? Now take a minute and use your occupation and industry card from your reference booklet and think about how you might probe industry if the respondent told you that his industry was technology. Now let's talk for a moment about how to record the answers that are provided. As the respondent responds to your questions and probes, please record her responses using her words. However, remember that the purpose here is to collect codable data. You do not need to literally record every word the respondent says. Please record the phrases which directly provide information about the occupation and industry. This is a little more advanced than just standard GIT. In GIT, you learn to record all open ends verbatim. GIT does tell you not to record digression. In the case of PSID, you can drop pronouns. So, for example, if a respondent says, "I work as a project manager in academic research. I love my job," you can just record project manager in academic research. Now let's look at a more complicated situation. You have a talkative respondent who is describing his job at a library in a lot of detail. He says, "The DVDs are $1 per item per day overdue. The books get 15 days with 1 day grace period. If it's lost, then they have to replace the item. The late fee is the cost of the item. If the item is returned, the fee is forgiven. Some of them don't have the money to pay the fine." You're listening carefully, and you know that this means that the respondent handles circulation, late fees, and fines. You can record it that way, but be sure to confirm with the respondent that you have it correct. You could say something like, "So, I understand that you handle circulation, late fees, and fines. Is that correct?" If the respondent is speaking faster than you can type, you should use task-related feedback phrases to control the pace. This is especially important because PSID is a telephone interview, so the respondent might not realize that you're trying to get down everything that they're saying. You could say things like, "I'm typing that into my computer. Could you repeat that so I can get it down correctly?" You can also slow things down by repeating the response as you type it in. And as always, read it back to the respondent for accuracy. Unlike other probes in the interview, occupation and industry probes are recorded. Whenever you probe, simply enter /PO/ for occupation questions and /PI/ for industry questions. You don't have to enter the actual probe, but if you ask a yes/no question, such as "Do you supervise anyone?" you will need to briefly note the question asked and the response. Remember that you will probe occupation only up to 3 times if needed. And if you feel that you've collected sufficient information with fewer than 3 probes, that's fine too. On PSID, there is such a thing as overprobing. There's a real risk to adding additional length and burden to the interview by probing more than you really need to. Our key goal is to collect just enough information for the occupation or industry to be accurately coded. Goldilocks probing. You're probably more at risk of overprobing when the job reported is quite simple. For example, the occupation might be working at a fast food place. You would certainly want to know if the respondent supervises anyone, but after they tell you the basics of what they do, cashier, working at the window, cook, cleanup crew, etc., you can stop. You can also go too far if you start asking questions about the others who work there, or lots of details about the type of work the people he or she supervises do, or how the respondent feels about their job. We don't need that information to code. Also, for reasons of confidentiality, never put the name of the employer in an open-ended response. We ask that information later in the interview where we can control its use, but it should not be buried in an open-ended response because those have to be edited out of the data. When we meet in person to discuss occupation and industry probing, you'll have a chance to go through all of this together and to practice. Take a moment now to note any questions you have about OCK probing in the appropriate part of your participant workbook. We look forward to seeing you live at the upcoming session on OCK probing.